All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to week 3, task 2. This time we already did task 1 earlier on another video. With this, we're going to go ahead and cover a lot of the major kingdoms that came about in the Middle Ages. But first, we're going to go ahead and start with the questions down here. Normally, again, I don't usually want you guys to use the questions and to try to sift through it to figure out what it is. But in this case here, it's easier to look up the questions. That way you can kind of know what you're looking for as you do read the entire passage here. Number 1, what was the name of Western France where the Vikings conquered and settled? Just one region there, and I actually mentioned it in the first half of this week's task as well there. How did William become known as William the Conqueror? And again, we'll talk about that. Why was the Magna Carta so important in England? Which king of France became more powerful than others before him? And how did he actually become more powerful? Why did the Crusades begin? Remember with all these, read the sentence completely, the question, and find out what they're asking. All right, so let's go ahead and start the reading here. It's going to be quite lengthy, just because it's a fairly large body here. So bear with me, and again, as if you go through here, if you're okay with it. So basically in section 1 you learn that Germanic peoples called the Angles and Saxons invaded Britain in early 400s. Just a different section here, so it actually didn't talk about in our part 1, but in the book itself it must be a different section there. So just remember this, basically this Germanic people called the Angles and the Saxons, which we get today call Anglo-Saxon if you would. They took over much of the country from the Celts, or the Celts, depending on how you want to say it, and usually it's the Celts, and set up many small kingdoms. In the late 800s, Vikings attacked Britain. King Alfred of Wessex, later known as Alfred the Great, united the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and drove away the Vikings. Alfred's united kingdom became known as England, or later on England. Alfred ruled England from 871 to 899. He founded schools and hired scholars to rewrite Latin books in the Anglo-Saxon language. However, the Anglo-Saxon kings who came after him were weak rulers. So again, we see this over and over. Who was William the Conqueror? In the 900s, the Vikings conquered part of western France across the English Channel from England. This region came to be called Normandy, after the Viking or Norsemen who ruled it. By the middle of the thousands, Normandy was ruled by William, a descendant of the Viking ruler who had conquered Normandy. William was also a cousin of King Edward of England. When Edward died, a noble named Harold Godwinson claimed England's throne. However, William believed that he, not Harold, should be king of England. In 1066, William and his army of knights landed in England. They defeated Harold and his foot soldiers at the Battle of Hastings. William was then crowned king of England and became known as William the Conqueror. So that's one of our questions, just like that earlier one in the same pretty much passage here. 2 questions right there. At first, the Anglo-Saxons resisted William's rule. He had to find a way to stop Anglo-Saxon revolts and to control his own soldiers. So basically, we have soldiers from France going across the English Channel and pretty much took over England. He did so by giving land to his Norman knights, when he made them swear loyal to him as ruler of England. William wanted to know all about his new kingdom, so he took the first census of Europe since Roman times, and we're going through the census right now, where they're counting folks and just seeing how many citizens are out there and just various demographics. This census was known as the Domesday Book. It counted people, manners, and farm animals. So it's not as dramatic with the name Doomsday as that we kind of have the connotation of what it is nowadays. The Normans who ruled England brought Europe's customs to England. Under William's rule, officials and nobles spoke French. Ordinary Anglo-Saxons still spoke their own language, which later became English. They also learned new skills from Norman weavers and other artisans. The Normans, in turn, kept many of the Anglo-Saxons' government practices. For example, they depended on local officials called sheriffs to keep order. As more and more Normans and Anglo-Saxons married, their ways of doing things merged into a new English culture there. So go ahead and read through this. Basically, on the right there, then they're talking about with the Magna Carta, the right to a trial in England was granted by the Magna Carta, which we'll talk about in just a second. But jury trials began in Europe about 50 years earlier. For each case, 12 jurors were chosen. In some villages, the same juror was chosen again and again because of their wisdom and status. Jurors were always men. The jury decided whether the accused was guilty or innocent. Now, in the United States, citizens are chosen at random for possible jury duty. Some states have reduced the number of jurors from 12 to 10, 8, or sometimes even 6. Juries usually decide a verdict and sometimes decide a sentence as well. So basically whether they're guilty or not, and then actually what their punishment should be. And then what is the disadvantage of choosing the same people to serve on the juries again and again? So just think about it. And like I said, at the end of the quarter here, we'll go through and talk about a lot of this stuff. Okay. Henry II and the common law. The power of the English king increased under Henry II. Henry ruled England from 1154 to 1189. Quite a long rule there. Henry used the law courts to increase his power. He set up a central court which trained lawyers and judges. Then he appointed circuit judges who traveled across the country or hearing cases. He also established common law, or law that was the same throughout the kingdom. Henry set up juries to handle arguments over land. In time, two kinds of juries developed. The grand jury, which decided whether people should be accused of a crime. The trial jury decided whether a person or accused person was innocent or guilty. Gotta forgive me, I'm a little late here. What was the Magna Carta? Henry's son John became King of England in 1199. King John raised taxes in England and punished his enemies without trials. Many English nobles resented the king's power. They refused to obey him unless he agreed to guarantee certain rights. The nobles met with King John at the meadow called Runnymede in 1215. There they forced John to sign a document of rights called the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. The Magna Carta took away some of the king's powers. He could no longer collect taxes unless a group called the Great Council agreed. Freemen accused of crimes had the right to fair trials by their peers or equals. Habeas corpus was introduced, which protects a person from being imprisoned indefinitely without a trial. The Magna Carta also stated that the king and vassals both had certain rights and duties. The Magna Carta was important because it helped to establish the idea that people have rights and that the power of the government should be limited. In the 1200s, another English king, Edward I, called for a meeting of the peoples from different parts of England. Their job was to advise him and help him make laws. This gathering, called the Parliament, was an important step towards representative government. At first, parliaments were made up of 2 knights from every county, 2 people from every town, and all high-ranking nobles and church officials. Later, Parliament divided into 2 houses. High-ranking nobles and the church officials met in the House of Lords. Knights and townspeople met in the House of Commons. Okay, we're going to just you can read these reading checks for you. The Kingdom of France. French king called Capetians conquered lands held by the English in western France and set up France's first parliament. Here, has a poll ever been taken? Okay, don't worry about that. In 843, Charlemagne's empire was divided into 3 parts. We learned that in part 1. The western part eventually became the Kingdom of France. In 987, Frankish nobles chose Hugh Capet to be their king. Hugh was the first of the Capetian kings of France. The Capetians controlled the area around Paris, the capital. Many French nobles had more power than the kings did. This began to change when Philip II became King of France. Philip ruled from 1180 to 1223. When he took the throne, England's king ruled parts of western France. Philip went to war against England and conquered most of these territories. As a result, French kings gained more land and became more powerful. Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, ruled from 1285 to 1314. In 1302, he met with representatives from the 3 estates or classes of French society. The first estate was the clergy, or people who had been ordained as priests. Nobles made up the second estate, and townspeople and peasants were the third estate. This meeting began the Estates General, France's first parliament. It was the first step in France toward representative government. Okay, got a good map here where it breaks down the different areas, pretty much especially with the different kingdoms that were going along here. You can kind of see a northwest or north, a north-south running there. Eastern Europe and Russia. After the Mongols destroyed the Kievan state, the rulers of Moscow built a new Russian state headed by a czar. About 500 people called the Slavs organized villages in Eastern Europe. Each village was made up of families related to each other. You remember we watched this quite a lot when we were studying the Muslims and the Byzantine Empire and their makeup there. Let me go on. The villagers shared their land, animals, tools, and seeds. Each family built its house partially underground. This kept the family warm during cold winters. In time, the Slavs divided into three major groups: the Southern, Western, and Eastern Slavs. The Southern Slavs became the Croats, Serbs, and Bulgarians. The Western Slavs became the Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks. The Eastern Slavs became the Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. By 600, the Eastern Slavs controlled the land between the Carpathian Mountains and the Volga River. In the early Middle Ages, the Eastern Slavs created farmland by chopping down the forest and then burning the trees to fertilize the soil. They planted barley, rye, and flax. So this is kind of like that slash and burn farming we learned in the very first week's lesson there, except it was a little bit more sustainable because they would actually use a different type of farming and different crops. What was the Kievan Rus? In the late 700s, Vikings began moving into the Slavs' territory from the north. Over time, the Vikings became rulers of the Slavs. The Slavs called their Viking rulers the Rus. Over time, the Vikings and Slavs intermarried and blended into one people. Remember, the Rus were the rowers because they were on the longboats. Around 900, a Viking leader named Oleg created a Rus state around the city of Kiev, called the Kievan Rus. This state was really a group of small territories. And again, I'm going to let you read this on your own up there. The main ruler of was the Grand Duke of Kiev. Local princes, rich merchants, and landowner nobles, called boyars, helped him govern. The rulers who came after Oleg increased the size of the Kievan Rus. In time, it reached from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. It stretched from the Danube River in the west and to the Volga River in the east. The growth of the Kievan Rus attracted missionaries from the Byzantine Empire. So again, this kind of sounds familiar. Remember this. One Rus ruler, Vladimir, married the Byzantine emperor's sister. He became an Eastern Orthodox Christian and declared his people Eastern Orthodox. We'll talk about the Crusades here. With the Crusades, European Crusades captured Jerusalem, but were later driven out by the Muslims. Okay, we see this first East-West kind of battle between religions there. We kind of alluded to it when we talked about the Muslims, and a little bit more when we talked about with the Byzantine Empire. But here's pretty much the Crusades in a nutshell here. During the Middle Ages, the Byzantine Empire in the east came under attack. In 1071, an army of Muslim Turks defeated the Byzantines and seized control of most of the Byzantine lands in Asia Minor. The Byzantine emperor did not have enough money or troops to drive out the Turks. In desperation, he asked the Pope to help him defend his Christian empire against the Muslim invaders. In 1095, Pope Urban spoke before a large crowd in eastern France. He asked Europe's lords to launch a crusade or holy war against the Muslim Turks. He urged them to capture Jerusalem and free the Holy Land where Jesus had lived from the Muslims. Okay, the Pope explained why the crusade was needed. And Jerusalem is the navel, and not as in sea power, but navel is like your belly button, center of the world. This is the land of the Redeemer, also known as Jesus, of mankind, illuminated by his coming. This royal city, situated in the middle of the world, is now held captive by his enemies. It looks and hopes for freedom. It begs unceasingly that you will come to its aid. Pope Urban II. As the Pope spoke, the excited crowd cried out, "It is the will of God, and it is the will of God." The Crusades begun. Early victories. Several thousand soldiers on horseback and many as 10,000 on foot headed east. Many of them wore a red cross in their clothes as signs of their obedience to the Pope's call. In 1098, the First Crusade captured Antioch in Syria. From there, the Crusaders entered Palestine, reaching Jerusalem in 1099. Sorry about that. In 1098, the First Crusade capture, we already talked about. After bloody fighting, they stormed the city, killing Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike. So again, not very good people. They would just go through and lay folks to waste. Here a map, we see the different crusades, Christian lands versus the Muslim, Muslim in green, Christian in yellow. And we see the different paths that they took for the different crusades there. Having driven the Muslims from the region, the Crusaders created 4 states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Palestine, the county of Edessa, and the Principality of Antioch in Asia Minor, and the county of Tripoli, where Lebanon is located today. These 4 states were surrounded by Muslims and depended on the Italian cities of Genoa, Pisa, and Venice for supplies. The Muslims fought back, however. In 1144, they captured Edessa. In the response, European rulers sent another crusade to regain the lost lands. This second crusade, however, was a total failure. In 1174, a Muslim named Saladin became ruler of Egypt. He united Muslims and declared war against the Christian states that the Crusaders had built. Saladin proved to be a brilliant commander. He defeated the Christians and captured Jerusalem in 1187. The fall of Jerusalem led to the Third Crusade. Emperor Frederick of the Holy Roman Empire, King Richard I of England, also known as Richard the Lionhearted, and King Philip II of France gathered their armies and headed east to fight Saladin. The Third Crusade had many problems. Frederick drowned crossing a river. The English and French arrived by sea and captured a coastal city, but were unable to push inland. After Philip went home, Richard secured a small territory along the coast. He then agreed to a truce with Saladin, promised that Christian pilgrims could travel to Jerusalem in safety. Around 1200, Pope Innocent III called for a 4th crusade. Merchants from Venice used the crusade to weaken their trading rival, the Byzantine Empire. They convinced the Crusaders to attack Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire. For 3 days, the Crusaders burned and looted the city. The attack shocked Western Europeans and weakened the Byzantines. So originally it was the Byzantine Empire asking for help, and it winds up on the 4th Crusade here. They wind up getting attacked by the folks that were originally supposed to help them out. 6 more crusades were launched over the next 60 years, but they achieved very little. Gradually, the Muslims conquered all the territory they had lost to the First Crusade. In 1291, a bit more than 200 years after the First Crusade had set out, the last Christian city fell to the Muslim forces. The Crusades affected Europe in 2 ways. They increased trade between Europe and the Middle East, and they helped break down feudalism. Nobles who joined the Crusades sold their lands and freed their serfs. This reduced their power and helped kings build stronger central governments. Kings also began taxing the new trade with the Middle East. These taxes helped them build stronger kingdoms in Western Europe. And that's the end. Sorry about the stumbling a little bit here. It's kind of a choppy writing there. But anyway, thank you for your time. If you have any questions or comments, please email me, and we'll hope we can help work it out. Thank you much. Bye now.